Not the Obi-Wanification of Wreath Silas.
Ram, be careful! I don't want you to become Anakin! Start your sublight engines, it's time for RuPaul's Pod Race, a queer Star Wars podcast. Welcome back to another week of chaos with a very special guest in honor of the recent release of Midnight Horizon. Just a heads up, there are going to be major spoilers for the novel and for all of the High Republic Phase 1 in this week's episode. My name is Mel. I use they, them pronouns. You can find me on social media at Melvin Culpa, and my gender this week is Comacvitis running into the woods.
It's like in Twilight. I think about him all the time.
Wreath Silas doing the sequence in New Moon where Bella's on the chair. Yeah.
Well, my name is Ollie. I use any pronouns. You can find me on social media at Ollie Fresh, and that's fresh with a PH. And my gender this week is Master Torben. Why in the stars would someone pick a dramatic new nickname for himself? Buck.
I love that part of the book so much.
I've forgotten about that part. I'm glad y'all appreciated it.
I'm just a Torben Buck stan through and through. He is my world.
Hi, my name is Klaudia. My pronouns are she, her. You can find me on social media at Klaudia Says, Kaludia Says. My gender this week is Cantum, Alexa, Play Circus by Brittany Sai. I love them so much. It's just, I'm literally obsessed with them. I think about them all the time.
Anyway, I'm Jess. My pronouns are they, them. You can find me on TikTok and Twitter at Kawaii Jessio. And my gender this week is rich people having no sense of awareness as they hold a Nihil-themed masquerade party.
I'm Noah. My pronouns are he, him. You can find me on all social media at The Jewish Jedi. And my gender this week is the Infinity Warification of Pribolt, because the poor guy did get turned to dust.
No!
That
Really
was
did.
so sad.
Apparently there's Pribolt truthers out there who are like, no, absolutely. Was that one of you?
No. I have had conversations with other people about if he is alive or not, though. I do believe over at Fulcrum Transmissions, we had a conversation about...
There was another podcast I was listening to yesterday. Not that I listen to podcasts about my own work a lot, but there was one where they were talking about like maybe there was no body. And I was like, there was no body because he turned to dust.
I like the mollification of Pribolt.
It's
I'm
more
obsessed with the idea of like, there wasn't a body. Horrible news. He did combust. Like, there's a reason there
allergic
isn't
to
one.
the sun. It's more like the loadedification of Pribolt.
No! Crash, I don't feel so good.
But anyway, my name is Daniel José Older. My pronouns are he, him. I'm on Twitter at DJ Older. I'm on Instagram at Daniel Jose 1, and I'm on TikTok at Daniel Jose Older. And my website is danieljoseolder.net. My gender is too fried in the brain to have a gender.
And that's valid
That's
of you.
fine.
So valid. So true.
Feel validated in my gender.
Gender affirmed.
Welcome to our podcast. Thank you so much for being on.
Great to be here.
I'm genuinely like so excited that you're here. And I guess we're gonna get into our little interview. I wanted to start with something kind of like easy, and just ask you like, what is your experience with Star Wars? Do you have a favorite piece of Star Wars media?
I think it's still Return of the Jedi after all these years. That was my number one entrance point at 3 years old. It was my first movie in the movie theater period. And it really changed me. Like, it's like, I've said it so many times at this point, it's just still true. Like, I just still adore that movie and worship it. And like, it pops up in all of my work, whether it's Star Wars or not. So it really does all go back to that for me. I really love just a lot of different stuff in Star Wars, like throughout recent and old, but I think that's number one.
Who would you say influenced your writing style? Like, was there anything outside of Star Wars that influenced this book as well?
Absolutely. Where to begin? So many. The number one writing inspiration I always come back to is Octavia Butler. She was one of the great sci-fi fantasy writers for sure of all time. And she really I had a seventh grade English teacher give me one of her books randomly before I knew I wanted to be a writer. And certainly before I knew I wanted to be a writer that would like bring more people of color into sci-fi. And that always felt like this little magic gift that I just didn't, realize I was getting at the time. I read it and it blew my mind. It was Bloodchild, a short story collection, but I didn't get it, And it was like 10 years later, I think almost, where I after leaving fantasy because I wasn't in there and being kind of disgusted with it, and then coming back around, And when I left fantasy, I was really trying to find books that would tell me the truth, because it felt like fantasy fiction wasn't doing that, So I was reading like Baldwin and Bell Hooks and, just like theorists and historians and everything. And then I kind of came back around a little bit because my roommate was obsessed with Harry Potter. And I was like, I did really love the books. I did pick them up and I was like, oh, this is really cozy and fun, but it's still a white dude saving the world. And it's still like people of color in like the barest, most barely there kind of ways, not even a real love interest, like a blow off love interest, and like, that sucked. So I found that really disappointing, and I found that the mythology to be really just like this rehashing the same European, mythos that we've been doing for so long. And then it was Octavia Butler. Some kids I was working with at a summer camp kind of thing in Bushwick were reading Octavia Butler, and I was like, oh, that's the one my English teacher gave me. So I picked it back up and I read everything by her. And I don't really usually read everything by any one writer, but with Butler I read everything, and it just really rocked my world just to realize like how deeply you can talk about power and, just these complex conversations, interpersonal and societal and everything, cultural, everything else, and still tell a really riveting sci-fi story that really like puts you into the world and changes the world. And that really like cracked it open for me. So everything kind of goes back to her.
I will say that like, not to get corny on me.
Get corny. I wrote Midnight Horizon. Like, you can get corny. Like, please.
Listen, reading that book, like, I truly, with the main characters of color, because the majority of the cast are people of color. Mm-hmm. I think Reith is our shout out to our one white boy.
He's the token. We have a token fight, right? Yeah, it's true.
Diversity
win. He's an unproblematic fave.
Unproblematic fave.
Diversity win. Reith is white.
He's also the token straight.
He's the token straight.
Isn't he the straight on thin ice according to the chart?
Yeah. That's exactly his place.
Right. I like when Vern was like, oh yeah, Reith, he's white, like my master Stellan.
I forgot about that in Out of the Shadows. But I will say that like it was very refreshing to like have this book where these characters got to explore like some pretty real stuff, and like also get to be part of this universe. Sci-fi is not it doesn't have a great track record.
Trash track.
Yeah. In terms of like having these complex people of color, let alone queer people of color. Cantum Side truly like is bounds away from the average character that you see in one of these books, and so like just getting their perspective was so refreshing and so exciting. I'm sorry, I'm just gushing at you. But
totally, you don't have to apologize to gush. It's quite all right. I enjoy every second of it.
Yeah, I think also something you mentioned is like the concept of power. And I think a lot of people look at sci-fi and say, oh, it's about power, like the Force. But there's also a level of power that is not a supernatural or not a like fantasy thing. Like there is a power within, and I think that the Force is a conduit for that. But I think like there's a lot of stuff in this book, especially with people who are non-Force sensitive. You see it a lot with Crash, where she's trying to be like, oh, I need to reconcile how much power I have over situations. So I think there's something really interesting about power, also power as a community, which is something Reith talks a lot about. So I think there's a lot of really interesting themes surrounding one's own power and community power.
Absolutely. I'm glad you picked up on that and brought it up, because that is really important. And along with exactly that conversation about Force and what that means, but also the societal powers that are at play that Crash is really hyper aware of, because she is A, not rich, and B, deals with rich people a lot, and deals with those societal stresses and what that means. It is kind of an interloper amidst all these different layers of society. And like ultimately what it comes down to for me, I think the lesson that Octavia Butler taught so many of us is that, power is like really interesting. Like it's like it makes for good literature. And I think the opposite is, we've been told, society has very often told us the opposite. And like lit bros have often told us the opposite. And the idea is like, you don't want to talk too much about power, it gets boring or didactic. Power is fascinating. It is so complex, so nuanced. And if you really enter into that conversation, and we all experience it in so many different ways. So it's not like this elite conversation that people are having. It's, it's the opposite, really. It's conversation that people with a lot of power don't want us to have. because that's when it gets uncomfortable for them.
Star Wars to me is at its best when it's political. Like all science fiction and fantasy, it's most interesting when it approaches thematic ideas that affect the real world and commentate on it, which is really interesting to me because when a lot of dude bros are like, I don't want Star Wars to be political, I'm like, horrible news. I would like it everywhere. We're gonna get into this a little bit later about like Jedi ideology, but there was a quote in Midnight Horizon that went something to the effect of like, the Jedi's belief in peace was quickly becoming a methodology for defeat. And it's one of my favorite lines in anything ever because it's really interesting to approach the concepts of like, what is the role of violence versus nonviolence? How do we deal with that? How do we approach that in terms of wealth and in terms of class? Right. And those were themes that I was not necessarily expecting out of a Star Wars book, but I was beyond thrilled to see there. And you mentioned, you know, all this like classic sci-fi that inspired you. And I think that's really prevalent too in the way that you write science fiction, like not Mel, not to like gush at you for a second, but like the environment you create has a very old sci-fi feel to it, which I really appreciated because I grew up on like the original Star Trek series. And I was like, I get this energy.
I did watch Star Trek, but I was never a big fan. But I do think everything you kind of take in is kind of spat back out, you know, when you start writing, certainly. But that's great to hear. Thank you.
I feel like we talked a lot. We've been talking a lot about power when we first started this podcast because we were talking about the Bad Batch, which is very focused on a period of time of transition and about like the establishment of fascism.
Right.
And so it was just interesting to see another time period. And the cool thing about the High Republic for me is that we see the same events from different points of view over and over. And in this case, we're almost seeing it on a micro level in one city from a couple different groups of people.
Right.
And that is just something that I personally love very much. That when you do the bottle episodification of science fiction, case in point, like my favorite episode of Doctor Who is that one where they're stuck on the plane. But it's just interesting because you can see the same concepts that are much larger in Star Wars, even in just one place. And it's I found it very interesting, and I liked how you were also able to weave in characters that felt very real is not the right word, but they felt like living and breathing people. I often feel like in Star Wars, but in a lot of genre stuff in general, you have characters that when you're dealing with higher concepts or whatever, like sometimes they don't have the time to feel like real people. Right. And it reminded me very much of probably my favorite piece of media of all time, which is Full Metal Alchemist. Which they're all gonna yell at me for mentioning this because I mention it constantly. But it's the thing that I love about that show, and the manga, whatever, is a very similar thing of that it's dealing with huge societal problems constantly and like a amount of plot and a crazy amount of characters. Right. But then the people feel real. There's moments of comedy and it switches back and forth a lot. And so that tone and the way that you built the characters with those, I just loved it very much, and that's why it's my Joker.
No, that's great to hear. I love that show too, actually, and it's not one that I thought consciously back to, but I watched it at a point when I was really like becoming a writer, you know, and so it did definitely. And I remember watching it being like, this is one of the greatest YA stories we have out there. Like that's really what it is, and it does its job really well, exactly because of that. It's connecting the very personal and the very political in like gigantic and epic ways. It has that huge cast. Like, was it you that was someone on Twitter was saying that Ram and Reeth's dynamic reminded them of the brothers?
That was me.
Yeah, that was Klaudia.
That was me.
I remember the other day I was like, someone said that to me, and I can't remember who. But that's it. You know, I'm sure again, like I'm sure it's in there because I wasn't consciously pulling from it, but it's like a really major piece of literature, I think.
Well, we've been talking about like parallels with outside media, but obviously Star Wars fans like to pull parallels within Star Wars a lot of times, and most of the time they're not on purpose. You know, it's like poetry, it rhymes kind of moments. Yeah. But were there any deliberate references or parallels or ones that you realized later? Or were there any other Star Wars like characters or plot lines that inspired ones in this book that you were like, I really like that thing. I like exploring that thing.
Right.
But I'm not directly working with that character or something.
Definitely. In terms of like actual like factual Easter eggs, the most of them are from Most Wanted, which I read in preparation for this book, knowing I'd be writing about Corellia, and I was like, what can I pull that would still be around, 150, 250 years earlier, 200 years earlier, whatever. So that's why we have like Paolo, who's like such an iconic character from that book, and I really wanted to like get into his backstory. So I emailed Ray, and I was like, did you have anything planned for Paolo's backstory? And she was like, I just, she just said she knew that he was, because the species isn't given, but she knew she wanted him to be a Carabash. What are they called? The guy from Rebels.
A Lasat?
Yeah, that's what he is, and that's what she was.
Sorry, everyone waiting for me to answer because that is one of my favorite Star Wars characters of all time.
Oh yeah, Zeb. Yes, he's amazing. I'm just not good with names. He'll forgive me. But that's why he's that, because I asked her, and she was like, I really didn't have anything planned, because you don't want to step on another writer's feet. So I just wanted to kind of check in, and she was like, no, go to town, So I just dropped him in real quick as like one of the bodyguards, But just stuff like that. There's little names pulled from there that kind of like you can work out that they must have gone on to become prominent, city fathers or whatever. Beyond that, I think like thematically, there's a lot of Star Wars stuff. I will say it wasn't totally conscious, but I do think that like Crash would be friends with Afra, if they were to have inhabited.
I can see that
time period. You know what I mean? And like they're both extremely chaotic and just really struggle with intimacy in very similar ways. Hopefully, they don't feel like they were cribbed from one another, or that I cribbed anything from Afra. But it works out really well, being who Crash is based on and everything else. So I think it just kind of works. Like they would just all be friends. They'd be very chaotic and probably lovers, and it wouldn't go well, and everything would whatever. But it would make for great stories.
So when can we expect that book to come out? I'm just wondering if I
Crash would be well dead by the time Afra is born.
Well, it's actually crazy. I heard Crash went through the world between worlds. I don't know if there's any truth to that.
Black Chrysanthemum could be alive, and he was friends with both of them.
That's true. If he was ever a silverback Wookiee in his past, and who knows? Because
I was gonna say you see the same eyes in different people.
Yeah, so speaking of kind of those interconnections, obviously there's a lot of parts that you have dealt with like in canon before, like for Last Shot. Mm-hmm. But what was it like writing and like working in the playground that is Corellia? Like, did you get to choose how much of the world you were going to build? And like, was it easier because you had an established planet that already had lore behind it?
Yeah, kind of. It was, I had a lot of freedom. I had like complete freedom, basically. I just had a meeting with Pablo and some other folks where I was just kind of like, all right, Corellia, what's up? And they were like, well, it's the high point, just like the rest of the galaxy. Think about like Detroit in its high point, and that's pretty much what you got. So run wild. And I was like, run wild? Like, really? Oh, okay, So I did, and that's a great thing to say to I'm a writer who loves world building, and loves lore and mythology and politics and everything else. So that was basically just permission. I mean, there's nothing else in development, to my knowledge, around that area, on that planet in this time period. So there's no reason to kind of be really, really careful. So it was just like, all right, take the Corellia we know from Solo and add a lot more lights and a lot more life. And that's kind of where we're going to go with it. And that requires a lot of world building as it happens. So it really just let me, both pull what I needed for the story to work, because I needed a very vibrant political scene for things to like, for Crash's sort of like know how to matter. She had to be able to work the inner, kind of like machinery of it all. So there had to be a machinery for her to work. So that's where all that came from. But also like it happened to be my happy place, which is figuring out little annoying local politics and bureaucracy and bullshit, which is what they were all dealing with, and like having a high society that involved giant underground worms. You know what I mean? Like that's all you need. So I did really cut loose. I think the last detail was, and I knew it writing the book, but I wrote it in such a flurry of activity that I just couldn't stop and like figure out this last piece. So it came sort of late in the game, but it was the music angle, which I love. It's really important. And I always write music. Like it's something that's in literally every book that I've ever written. which is why it was odd that it wasn't in this. It's great that it got in there. But Spheno and her family, being like a prominent Corellian music, like local icons, basically, that become intergalactic stars. She was a star in the draft that I turned in, but we never got a chance to really understand what her music was. And I was like, oh, this is a great opportunity to like build it in there now that the book is written, and I can chill a little bit and just like concentrate on that, which is where Kalank comes from, and like just giving that some lore and history.
I can't remember who the POV character is when we see this, but when they're describing her and her family performing, I was like entranced. I read that I reread that like 5 times.
Oh, thank you. But that's great.
I thought it was the idea of her voice sounding like it's rippling like through water is just so cool. But the other thing I think too for me is I'm not really someone who cares a lot about like planets themselves, because I think a lot of the times in Star Wars they will say like, here's a planet you should care about, but then don't tell me why I should care about it.
Right.
But I felt like this planet felt so vibrant, and you could tell you had a lot of fun with like the little details and some of the local stuff, because I genuinely at the end of this book was like, okay, I want to know more. Like, I want to get back into it. Like, I'm like, I need to reread things that have Corellia in them, because now I'm back into it. So I thought that was like a really, really nice touch.
Good. That was my plan.
I'm pretty sure at the end, Crash's mom's house, is that not where
Kira?
Kira. Is that not where she is from? But just,
It is where she's from.
Not terrible.
But right, but not swamps anymore. I love the idea of it. Cities change, right? And it's important to see that, get a sense of that change, and having different characters come from the same place when it looks totally different. Such a cool opportunity to do that when you're telling stories that span literally centuries, right?
I'm obsessed with the idea of Han Solo canonically from Space Detroit. I'm obsessed with that. And the whole time I was like, I love this.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, I liked it a lot because I feel like sometimes in Star Wars things feel like they popped out of nowhere. So like it was nice to feel like, one thing I like about all the High Republic, but specifically about this, was that like it feels like it's been around longer, so it feels more concrete almost, which I appreciated. And also like Solo is a movie. But I really like found my way to love Corellia over the course of this book, which was very fun because I was not anticipating that at all.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
On the note of the whole book itself, one of the things that I literally could not stop thinking about as I was reading was that the way that these Jedi approached their relationships, both interpersonal and romantic, was really interesting, but also fundamentally different from almost everything else in Star Wars. And I guess I was wondering, like, were these themes that you had always wanted to explore with these characters? Was this like a thing? I know you mentioned on the Fulcrum Pod that like Lula and Zine had been a goal for a long time, but like getting character development with Cantum and Comac and Reath, and like seeing how they deal with their relationships and the Force, was that something you'd always wanted to explore? And like, how did you conceptualize that?
Yeah, I think all of us went into this being like, all right, so, we're in a more free time for the Jedi, not just like free in the sense of like, as a whole, the Order has a different take, but more in that like every Jedi within the Order has the freedom to have very different understandings of the Force, And I think we see that best in Comac and Cantum's friendship and the different ways that they perceive tragedy and love around them. But you're right, it's throughout. And it is a conversation I've always wanted to have, because it's so intriguing, right? Like, you have this order of these warrior. It's almost like there's contradictions at the heart of it, but that's not a bad thing. Like, and I think there are really interesting ways to deal with it. And then just as someone who's like meditated and studied lots of different traditions on meditation and on the idea of being present, I think like, and then just as a person who loves people, like, these are all things that we all struggle with. It's not just Jedi. Like, we all have to figure out how to love and let go. We all have to figure out, how to be present in this moment right in front of us, like whether we're actively studying that or not. And so I think the Jedi are just a very heightened example of that, because they live by a particular code that demands that of them. And what does that mean? To make that commitment in your life, but also to be a part of the world, right? I think we have an idea of monks very often as like just being separated from the world and disappearing into a monastery. But these are people who are very involved in the world, whether it's diplomatically or as warriors or as peacekeepers or whatever, it may be. And so that sets them aside as like having to struggle in a very particular way with all those concepts. Because once you're in the world, you're gonna fall in love, right? You're gonna be at war because it's a world at war, and that's what it means. So that creates, on the one hand, great tension and opportunities. As a writer, that's just a great way to have tension. But I think also like, and this is something cool, that the Fulcrum folks were talking about that I appreciate, is that like we also get to see like healthy relationships, which is not often a thing. And I think sometimes there's like a writer need to just like grab every possible opportunity of tension and shove it into the book, regardless, just because that's good writing. And, the tension is good. Tension is good, but you don't have to have it everywhere, And I do think it's really important to show like people being healthy in different ways in their relationships and like model that. I don't think a book should be like a how-to guide on a relationship, not a fiction book. But I think it's really great to be able to have these moments to show friendships. And like, what does a healthy friendship look like in the midst of war and other forms of tension? So like, what does a healthy mentor-mentee relationship look like? God knows we need some examples of it in Star Wars, because there's so many like really terrible relationships between, master and apprentice that are like, oh no. And I just think it's all good to explore, right? And that's not a critique. That's like, that's why that's the engine that drives so much of the prequels, and it should, because it's the downfall, right? So what does it look like when it's not the downfall? That was really a question in front of us. So it's natural that we're all kind of wrestling with it, right? And what's super interesting is that we do all wrestle with it really differently. Cavs Jedi like think about attachment in very different way than a lot of my Jedi do, and I love that. Like that, also not a critique. Like that's what makes the High Republic so cool. And I've mentioned Cav specifically because he also deals with a lot of these same questions very much on the page, in the internal thoughts. And I think that's great. Like we're in conversation, and like, and Claudia's too, right? Like pulling Comac out of, specifically, out of Into the Shadows and putting Comac, like pairing Comac with Kantam was very intentional, because I knew that they come from very, very different places. So it was cool to see them struggle and, put them in a position where they would struggle literally in conversation with each other, which is how you get that moment when they're like, okay, Starlight is going down and they need our help, but we are here. What do we do, right?
I will say I really appreciated the diversity of thought within the Jedi. I completely agree that like the Jedi that we see in like The Rising Storm as compared to this book are like thinking about things differently, and it makes the Order feel less like it feels like a community and not just like this kind of like nebulous idea. And I really love that. And I just love all of the kind of different relationship dynamics that you brought into this book. Like you said, like not even the Jedi have these kind of like relationship, not issues, but like dynamics. Like Crash's entire arc is about trusting people. And I don't know. I love that. I love that Comac says to Reith, "You're my student. I'm going to create this boundary. You're not taking on my shit."
It's important to see that and to like get a chance to understand it. And then the other piece that I think like the question of attachment, right? Or the question of not even attachment, but just like emotion, right? Like I feel so bad for Comac, because Comac seems to really feel like you're not supposed to feel things. And he feels that way because there are people within the Order who really like push that. And that's clearly what won out by the time we get to the prequels. But I don't think that's like a very healthy approach, right? And I think that's why you have Kantam being like, you feel things and you release them. You feel them and you release them. And the fact that you feel them again doesn't mean you failed, right? Like that's such a key part of just like life, but it gets away from us, and we don't learn. No one teaches you that, right? And even in like the way sometimes they teach meditation, it's like, you're not supposed to think. And it's like, no, like you think, you have thoughts and you label them as thoughts and you let them go. You have feelings and you label them as feelings and you let them go, right? Like you're not wrong for having them. It's like we're so like hard on ourselves. It's not about that. It's like, yeah, okay, I had a thought, let it go. Oh, I had another thought. Oh my God, I have failed. I'm going to meditation hell. Not how it works.
That moment between Yoda and Kantam where Yoda's like, did you not think it was difficult for me to like let you go live your life? I admit that was a bit of a gut punch, because when Kantam was like, okay, I'm gonna go off on my own, and Yoda was like, okay, have a great time with that. I was like, wait a minute, this isn't how we're supposed to do this. This is never how we've ever done this. But seeing that come full circle was really interesting to me. And I also liked it because I was like, oh, that's why Kantam is the way that they are. Like that entire sequence really built on their character. But what I loved about it was Yoda being this sort of perfect model of healthy detachment. Because for a character who gets so maligned in the later parts of Star Wars, I was like, no, he's kind of Yasin Slay right now. Like, he models this perfect conception of being able to love something and let it go, because he recognizes that for Cantum, the best thing to do right now is not to be in the Jedi Order. And also, Yoda doesn't frame that as a failure on Cantum's part. Like, exactly. Yoda's like, okay, this might not be for you, and that's okay, and I can accept that. Right. Clearly, that ideology did not survive to the prequel era, but that's okay. And also, just as a Jewish person whose culture is so steeped in the concept of having large volumes of diversity of thought and arguments about text and dogma and faith, et cetera, this book exploring that was very interesting. Like, you mentioned that moment with Comac and Cantum when Starlight falls. And I reread that section multiple times because their separate reactions were really interesting to me, of Comac being like, I'm going to collapse and throw up, and Cantum being like, I have to be calm right now because I cannot control that whatsoever. Like, I'll put some trust in the universe that everyone that I care about is fine. But aside from that, I'm not able to do it. And seeing those two reactions literally like physically next to each other was really interesting to me in terms of like Jedi ideology. I really loved that.
I never thought of it, but it is like the Torah and the Haftorah, right? Like, by responding back and forth. There's a little commentary in the side. But I mean, literally, like like if the fallen star is the Torah, then Midnight Horizon is the Haftorah.
Yeah, I can't wait for Rashi to show up in the High Republic.
Indeed, and Maimonides. But to your point, it's also that this was a moment I really needed in there, is that Cantum, we say like trust the Force all the time, and like may the Force be with you, and da. And like I feel like there's a misunderstanding even amongst characters that like that means everything is going to be okay. And Cantum very specifically, and Reith in another moment, no one is like everything's going to be okay. Things might be really bad. In fact, they are. And they're very aware of that. And Cantum is like, I trust in the Force not to make everything all right, but to give me the tools that I will need to get through whatever I need to get through. And those are two like polar opposite things from each other, but like they get very conflated and they kind of fall into one another when we say things like trust in the Force. What does that mean? Like, trust in the Force to what? Because Starlight is down. You know what I mean? Like, things did not go okay. The Force did not save Starlight. But what the Force can do, and what I think a Jedi like Cantum is very aware of, is that, as they say, like, the practice of detachment is meant for exactly moments like these. And that's why it's a practice. It's something that you have to try again and again to get.
And I think that that's also kind of to go back, like, it's the situation vis-a-vis Yoda is very interesting. And I think especially in Midnight Horizon, because as Noah said, like, he tends to get maligned a lot. And I think something that we had said was like, it's almost like if like a kindergarten teacher got asked to be like the Secretary of Education overnight in the prequels, where it's like suddenly he's like, I just want to be a cool little teacher, and like, yeah, I'll run the order, whatever. And then they're like, okay, now you need to fight a war.
Right.
And he's like, cool, I'm so unprepared. But Midnight Horizon really spells out, and especially through Yoda, like, it changes your perspective of Yoda as a character in the grand scheme of Star Wars, not just in this book or not just in the High Republic, but this informs so much of who he is as a master and as a person.
And as a doula.
Later. Exactly. But it's just really interesting hearing him talk about like letting go in a healthy way, and how like, it sort of reaffirms like in the prequels and in a lot of stuff, like attachment attachment leads to possessiveness. And that's the problem.
Right.
And that's like, Anakin wanted to own Padme, and that's why that was a problem for them.
Right.
It's not that you can't experience love and care and that sort of thing. I think this book really like illuminated that.
And that's also why, Cantum being in their master's footsteps, that little tiny moment that I really wanted to get in there, when Savino has that stalker show up, they're on bodyguard duty, and they're all like, okay, ready for anyone to attack or whatever, and then this freaking stalker from like the college days shows up, or whatever, high school, and it's like, I just need Savino, and Cantum does the little Jedi chicken, is like, go home and think about your entire life and society and what got you to this moment, and redo all of that. You know what I mean? It's like, but that's, it's a small thing, but that's attachment, right? Like, that's a form of possession. And that's exactly what we're trying to like not have happen, and healthy relationships.
I had did a full 360 on Yoda, and this was the end of that arc. Like I started out as being like, I hate that little green war criminal gremlin. If I see him, it's hands on sight. And like, there's people I introduced to Star Wars, and I was like, I hate that. I hate him so much. And then I rewatched the Clone Wars. I was showing it to some friends, whatever. And then I was like, oh, I like the Jedi Order. They're victims. Oh no, maybe I don't hate them. Like, even in I know we've been talking about like, oh, in the prequel era they're different or whatever, but like I would argue like they're actually not and whatever, but they're not. There's certain things that actually aren't too different or whatever. And then I'm like, oh, actually, maybe I don't hate him that much, whatever. And then in this book, it was like the end of that. And the thing that sealed it for me that I loved very much, and something that in Star Wars is uniquely heartbreaking, was the interactions, and you get this a lot in the High Republic. This is something that I love, the interactions between different species with different lifespans. So Yoda is someone who by definition has to learn how to let go, and I think almost by default he has had to learn that, and actually we see that with Buryaga as well a little bit. And I was like, oh no, of like, and it, how does that shape the cultures of species that live longer versus ones that don't? And it seems like humans, the attachment thing was really kicking their ass, while for other ones, like, they're used to loving people and letting them go. Like, I could argue that Chewbacca is the best Jedi. But to me, it was like, wow, Yoda has had to do this by default so often. And the thing that I loved very much was you putting in there, like, Cantum seeing a little bit Yoda get a little sad about that. Clearly he has had to do that again and again, and then be like, that's life, that's how it is. And I was like, oh no, maybe I don't like Star Wars anymore. I'm very sad. That's also, both Yoda and Wookiee characters always make me sad for that reason. But
the Obertuck, the moment that really comes through, I think, in my own work is actually with Obertuck and Farzala, when they're, Farzala's thinking, Obertuck is taking a nap, and Farzala's like, man, remember that time that my master actually gave me the answer to what I was looking for right now in this moment about fear and death. And like, I just feel like if you're really about it, like, if you really believe that we go to the forest, then like, death sucks because you miss the person, but it's not the tragedy that I think humans and other short-lived species kind of like make it out to be a lot, like instinctively, automatically, like, oh God, everything sucks, someone died. And it's like, but are you about it? Or are you just saying, that it's cool to join the living force?
So a big piece of this was Ram and Reith's relationship, but one thing that I really appreciated was that covering their trauma. And something I've noticed a lot is, in general, like in sci-fi stories or just in adventure stories in general, and this often happens in Star Wars, like, just L after L happens to child characters, adult characters, and we never really have time to address that thing. And you'll often see like the hurt comfort genre is real big in fan fiction, because people are like, when are we going to process that? It was really interesting that that you chose to focus on that for both of them. Like, where are they at right now? And specifically these two characters, especially because one of them is a little bit younger than the other, because it's a franchise about war, and we also have child soldiers a lot in Star Wars. And so I guess, what was your approach to shaping their reactions, like specifically for each character? And was it something like, hey, we want to address this because, it's Star Wars, not Star Peace? Was this something you wanted to focus on in general with the Luminous authors, or is that just something that like you personally find interesting?
No, I think we all do it. Justina's the one that comes to mind first, but I think all of us do it, in different ways, and that's what's so cool about it. Is just like with the Force, like, all the characters also deal with their trauma differently. I think when we're starting out, we were seeing it with the Force much more so because it was kind of a peacetime at the beginning, and now everyone's all fucked up, and we're like seeing what that looks like for everybody, all the different Jedi, all the different characters across the board. Ram, especially being so young, I thought it was really important to deal with that he really just, his whole arc is about getting tossed into the fire and not really wanting to. I can never remember who, but someone pointed out how he's like, his arc and his whole vibe is like the anti-Luke Skywalker, because he's like, I really just want to sit in my garage in my provincial little backwater planet and do my thing. And Luke is like, I must go out and fight the Empire. And it's like, chill, farm boy, like, in a good way, like just chill mechanic. Like Ram is like, I just let me be a mechanic, right? And that's cool. But he can't be, because it's not cool, because then I'll show up on his front doorstep, right? And so he gets thrown into the action in a very opposite way from Luke. And like, it sucks. Like it's hard for him, and I think in some ways crafting their two narratives was about crafting a narrative that we're going to crafting two arcs that were going to be in contrast to each other, much like with Kantam and Comac, right? So I knew that these two were going to be together, and I knew I had relative freedom to kind of figure out where they were going to start and where they were going to end. And I wanted those things to be like, to make sense in conversation, right? So with Wreath, it's so much more a teenage thing of just being like, what is my path? Where am I going? I very literally like took the last beat of Klaudia's book and used it as the first one of Wreath's. Not that, he obviously goes through a lot in Justina's work, but he just gets his ass kicked so much. But it's less in terms of an arc and from that point, and more in terms of the journey that he's on in that specific book. And I really wanted to take him from this place to, this was a moment that really just spoke to me as like, this notion of his, it's like he really implants himself in like, this is my path as a Jedi. And that seemed like a really useful moment to shake him up, right? And to be like, well, what does that path look like? What does it mean to have a path? None of us really have a path except the one we make, right? But that's a journey that you have to figure out literally by making that path, right? And that tracks so well with someone who doesn't feel anything, and whose response to trauma is to shut down entirely and just not feel, because feeling is so complex, right? It's not just that it feels bad, it's that sometimes it feels good, and feeling good feels bad, and all of those different things, right? So it's very natural, I think, for someone like Ram to just be like, you know what, we're just not gonna feel, without making the conscious decision, and in fact, being very uncomfortable with that decision, because then he's like, wait, I don't feel anything, what the hell, right? And that's what we do. And so, and it gives us this beat of like, him then feeling too much, and then Wreath being like, this really important truth that we also just, I think, miss a lot, which is that you cannot actually find balance without going too far in both directions. You can't. We think of balance as this like perfectly poised, figure meditating or something, right? And like nothing rocks them, and they're just, everything is great. And like, you don't get there without going too far. That's just not how balance works, like not physically and not emotionally or anything else. So, and sometimes you need someone to step in and just say that to you. And that's literally all that happens. So the Wreath is like, look, you are imbalanced, but that doesn't mean that you're not finding balance. And that's what you have to do. And once you know that, then you can do it. Like, it doesn't mean it's easy or you just snap your fingers and it happens, but at least you now know which direction you're going, and what to look for. And that's where it is.
I think something that I noticed that this conversation is reminding me of is when Wreath talks about how he felt in Out of the Shadows when he woke up and was not with his master or his friends. And he was like, oh, I was terrified. I think that's like, it's really interesting to kind of touch on where he was and like where he is now. Exactly. But I think the other thing too is Wreath kind of has this like older brother energy to Ram. Right. And I think we see that character arc and that type of archetype a lot, but it's not super often that we see that older brother character also not know what they're doing. Right. Like, which I thought was like really cool, because it's saying like, hey, there's a huge pervasive theme of like, oh, well, two people, one is the mentor and one is the mentee. And this is a huge theme in this book, is that both have something to learn from each other. So yeah, I just thought that was really cool.
When you mentioned being able to find balance, you have to go to one extreme and the other extreme. And then you were talking about, oh, we've never really had that like older brother character who's also struggling. I was like, oh, he's Obi-Wan. Because with Obi-Wan, especially in the Clone Wars, you see him, he goes to both extremes. Like, he's very like, I am on the side of the light. I am a member of the council. I'm this and that. And then he goes to like, I am this close from murdering Maul. I am at my tolerable limit. And like he goes on his different things, and eventually he's like, you know, pinnacle of the Jedi, you know, pinnacle of balance, like, you know, all these kinds of things. And he's able to do that because he vacillates back and forth, but he also is that hey, I don't know what I'm doing because I'm the older brother. Another favorite white boy. Reith he followed in Reith's footsteps.
Right, without even knowing it.
I can't with that. I feel like so often in narratives where characters are like, I don't know what to do, they figure it out in a couple hundred pages, and then by the end of it, they're like, cool, I'm ready to go. And Reith's conclusion being like, actually, I think I might have to spend the rest of my life figuring this whole direction thing out. Was really nice. I will say, I mean, you know, people found their paths in this book, and Comac found his into the woods, and that happens sometimes. But I really appreciated his ability to be like, I don't know, like, I have no idea what's going on. I'm just going to do my best. And I was like, okay, you know, this ending works for me. I felt like by the end, he was actually ready to be a knight. And so when that happened, I was like, this is deserved. This makes sense. He's come to a good place. And then Comac pulled an Edward Cullen and sprinted into the darkness.
That was actually one of the first things I asked. I kind of checked in about when I realized that Reith was going to be a major character in this book, was that can we knight him at the end of it? And again, I hit up Klaudia and I hit up the team, and I was like, all right, this is what I want to do. Klaudia, I just want to make sure you didn't have plans, just like with Ray, but in the forward-looking way, you know. I was like, I just wanted to make sure you didn't have plans for that knighting to happen in one of your stories, or what that would look like, or, you know, just let me know. And she was like, go to town, kid. And so was everyone else. And that really just made sense. Like, that's just, he's earned it, first of all. He's fought really hard, both internally and externally. Like I said, he's gotten his ass kicked through 3 entire books, like on multiple levels. He's fallen in love with literally everybody, you know, and just when someone said it's like the trinity of
every queer woman he meets, he falls in love with.
It's like, yeah, an ace Jedi, right? Like, it's just not good. It's sir, a Nile and a super gay bodyguard. Like, maybe just give up. It's a good thing he's a Jedi, right? Like, it's not even just go be a Jedi.
I'm like, Reith, I'm begging you to learn something about yourself here and recognize that the type of person you keep being attracted to has one important detail involved.
0 for 3.
He just likes girl bosses, okay? And I relate to that.
Yeah, same. But damn. But yeah, no. The concept behind Reith's arc is really this poem that has really guided me, that says, you know, there is no path, you make the path by walking. And that's always been just a very like crucial line for me, like whether it's in life or in writing. It's something I always end up teaching, you know, when I'm teaching writing. And it's just a reality, like, that we, you know, don't talk enough about. But once you kind of think that way and see it, and I have to constantly remind myself that's part of why it's in there, you know, but like, I feel like it's very freeing to realize that, and not, I think there's a understanding of it that's like, oh, it means you just go do nothing, but like, clearly that's not the case, right? And I think it means you honor the fact that there is no path. Like, it's just about looking at reality for what it is, and understanding that you need a machete, you know, to make that path. And that's just, you know, it's not a mistake that after he has that realization, he looks down and Kantam and Comac are literally chopping through the Nile lines with their lightsabers, like making their path by walking it in the most violent possible way.
This is kind of off topic, but in this book, another like main POV character is Kantam Sai. What led you to having them be one of the main perspectives of this book, and like their story in this? Because in the High Republic Adventures comics, you know, they've been there kind of, you know, as Lula's master, but like having this kind of deeper exploration of them.
Yeah, and part of it was knowing that a book is a perfect way to do that. You know, Kantam is a character I've always wanted to explore more deeply, and I wasn't sure when or what the opportunity would be. But in looking at this book, it was, from the jump, there's always going to be a multitude of voices, and that's something I love about Star Wars books in general, is that we get all these different POVs, and so it's kind of exciting to figure out who's going to be the POV in each book. I really wanted, some of them were really basic, like, of course we're going to have Reith in there, like continuing in the trilogy, and him playing a major role and stuff. And for me, Ram is really particular, pulling him from the middle grade, and I just love him. And then Zine, obviously Zine. With Cantam, it was like, I really wanted a thread really throughout this book to take us outside of it a little bit and deal with some of the things that were happening more thematically and less plot-wise. And so having a character that is really set in their adulthood in terms of their coolness and their like got it togetherness, but then using that character to jump backwards and find a time when they were absolutely chaotic and a total disaster in the best possible way, felt like a really good opportunity to both like thematically talk about stuff, take us out of the action a little bit. And then I also really wanted to bring in a different writing style and have something much more kind of flourishy and romantic and kind of free flowing. And so for that section, like I really didn't know where it was going to go. I really went into it just being like, well, let's find out what happened with Cantam. I knew there was going to be a gap year, but I didn't know what that would look like or any of that. So I let it kind of flow as I went, which was very gratifying because the rest of the book was very planned out, very architected and figured out. And I really went in with like, okay, I need all these pieces. And it had to be, right? All those different elements at play. It was a necessity. So with Cantam, it was almost my way to just be like, every time I'll come up to one of those sections, like, let's find out, right? I knew that by nature of who they are and the moment of their life that we were dealing with, it was going to touch on what was coming for Comac and what was already in play for Lula. And so it was kind of natural. So it really allowed me to just free flow it, which is what I did. And of course, like them being a non-binary Jedi who's a human, is really important. And I wanted to get, them on the page as much as possible because of that in part, and so they weren't just like some badass in the background, right? And like just some cool figure that we don't really ever get to know personally. And then finally, I really wanted them to be deep in the midst of the action and like have those, that I knew there was a huge action moment, like year-long battle. This huge battle that happens overnight. I knew that was coming, and I just wanted to see like Cantam Sai, action hero, like just in the thick of it, and like going through it and swinging that lightsaber and like kicking ass, but also having that moment come at the tail end of such an emotional journey, even though it happened so long ago, was really kind of what I think made it all work.
It works so well alongside the Bake Off. Because like right. We see in High Republic Adventures, we see Cantam do a lot of very cool things, right. But seeing like in the Bake Off, that's one of the first times we really see them display that type of right. hands-on heroism.
Right.
So seeing that balanced with what we see in Midnight Horizon is really cool. And it really like establishes what kind of character and what kind of Jedi they are. And like I feel like they're super developed in considering how many High Republic books, how many pages there are, right. like in a considerably shorter amount of time than a lot of other characters. So I think like their essence has really been captured. I think that's really cool.
It's good. And then the other thing I want to say was the first thing we know about them actually from Race to Crash Point Tower is that they're incredibly badass when it comes down to it, but they're extremely calm in every other moment, right? I just wrote that because I thought it sounded cool. And then I wrote it and I read back on it and I was like, now I have to show them being really badass, which isn't a bad thing, but that's part of why I wanted to make sure we did get that in there in phase one, is like, because you're basically making a promise with a statement like that, right? And if you just leave it there, it's like, I guess we have this badass Jedi, but we never get to see it play out. So
pairing it with the Bake Off is so funny to me because that means that Cantam's, I don't know, coping mechanism is just telling little stories. Like canonically, Cantam is just like that person who's like, oh, so like this one time always has this batshit story for everything, and I do love that because there's always that person in a friend group, and it's clear that was Cantam's little coping mechanism. They were like, so anyway, instead of listening to a podcast, what if I just tell you this crazy story?
When are Cantam and Torben Buck getting a podcast? That's the next hire. That's what I want for phase 3.
If there's one thing you hope people take away from this book, what would it be?
That's a tough question. That's a great question. I think the main essence of it can come down to the idea of facing the world for what it is and not what you want it to be and not what you fear it to be, right? And that includes, by the world, I include the self, right? And I think mostly we see that in terms of the self. In all of the character arcs, they're required sometimes violently to really look at themselves and deal with what they're dealing with and not like turn themselves into some fake, doesn't feel anything Jedi or, whatever they're not, but they think they're supposed to be. Like, none of that works, right? So throw it all out, deal with what's in front of you, deal with what's inside you, and take it from there. And then on a kind of a quieter background way, I think we see a lot of people dealing with things like the threat of the Nile by not dealing with them, by hoping that they're not so bad, or by like pretending that that's a outer rim problem and the outer rim and the core worlds are separated when that's not true, right? All those things are in there, on one level or another. And we see over and over that it is a fatal mistake to pretend things aren't the way they are. That's true of history. That's true of personhood. That's true of emotions. That's true of politics. It's true across the board. And ultimately, I hope people see, folks struggling with it, not necessarily knowing how to do it, but struggling with it actively. And that is actually how you do it, is that you struggle with it. It doesn't always work. And sometimes you fail, and that's part of that journey. And then you do it again, right? And sometimes you do it and it works, and you still have to do it again. And that doesn't mean you fail. And here we are.
Is there somewhere else, like where else can people find you, and what else have you been working on coming up exciting?
Yes. Well, I gave all my socials at the top of it. I think Twitter is my most active one. I haven't had time to do TikToks recently. I do enjoy TikTok a lot, but I haven't done any. But yeah, mostly you can find updates about me on Twitter. My website, DanielJoséOlder.net, has all of my books. It also has links to some classes I taught online on a site called Skillshare, where I teach about narrative fundamentals and things like that. That can be super helpful. It also has my blog from back when I was a medic, which is kind of how I started writing. If that's interesting to you, my next book is a young adult novel called Ballad and Dagger. Here is the arc of it. That's not the final cover, but I'm really excited about it. It comes out from Rick Riordan's imprint. It's his first YA. It's their first YA. It is all the things you love about Rick Riordan books, but browner and in Brooklyner. So, and that's not a knock, because Rick is amazing at including lots of different characters. So bless him. But yeah, it's got pirates and true love and demons and gods and everything else. And it's really a book that's like very much who I am, obviously, because I'm a pirate. So thank you all for having me. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for talking
with you all. My pleasure. We'll do it again.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. See you later. May the force be with you.
Bye.
Thank you so much again to Daniel José Older for coming onto our gay little podcast. We really appreciate it. It means a lot. And thank you so much for joining us this week for Roop Helps Pod Race. Episodes usually drop on Sundays. For updates, Star Wars news, and more cursed shit, follow us on social media at Roop Helps Pod Race on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. If you really love the show, please rate and review our show on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, Spotify, or Overcast. It means a lot to us. May the Force be with you, and don't curve it up. For light,
and life.